Max Caulfield is not a time traveler. Daniel Diaz is not a telekinetic. Rachel Amber is not a pyrokinetic. And Alex Chen both is and isn't an empath. Welcome to part 4 of Life is Strange Powers Are Not What You Think They Are. Today we will be breaking down the original game protagonist, the ubiquitous, the one and only Max Caulfield. Now, while you don't need to watch my video on Daniel Diaz to understand this, I do recommend it because they are somewhat interconnected, so if you haven't, go back and check that one out. People often walk away with the impression that Max Caulfield is a time traveler because her power is rewinding time or also time jumping into photos. People feel like her power as it develops in double exposure doesn't make a whole lot of sense because it has no relationship to time. What if I were not only to tell you that Max Caulfield is not a time traveler in the strictest sense, but also her development of her power in double exposure makes perfect sense for what she actually is. In fact, if you had asked me, like last year, what I would have thought Max's power could evolve into, I would have told you probably exactly what double exposure came up with. Which, incidentally, the comics kind of had a similar version of and was also understanding exactly what Max is and why she would have this kind of power. Let's start by breaking down Rewind. Rewind in and of itself seems a pretty straightforward time manipulation until you realize what she's actually doing. One of the more confusing aspects about Rewind is the ability for Max to take objects with her from one place to another, as well as for her to no longer remain in the same location she was in prior rewinded time. During episode 3 Chaos Theory, the principal's office scene is the perfect example of this, where she ends up on the other side of the locked door after it was blown up in a prior existence. That scene always stuck with me because that was the first time I realized that Max was not just doing simple time travel. When Max is rewinding time, she is not going back in time. What she is doing is reversing entropy. This is a very oversimplified definition, but in short, entropy is the physical law about the expenditure of energy through a period of time. More specifically, that it can only move in one direction, right? If I have an ice cube and I melt the ice cube in front of you, I can't reform that water back into an ice cube. I could recollect the water and freeze it, but it would be a different ice cube. Being a three-dimensional being bound by the singular direction of entropy means that I would never be able to return the molecules inside that former ice block back to their previous order. Another common example is like breaking something, like a pane of glass or a teacup, right? If you do that, you can put all the pieces back together, but that crack will remain because the energy expended to break apart that structure cannot be reversed. Unless, of course, you're Max Caulfield. Max is not jumping back to a time before an event happens. What she is doing is denying that that event ever happened at all. And in terms of causality, that is so much worse, especially when she has objects that followed along a certain path because of the direction of time and entropy, and then she reverses entropy of everything else except that object is now created an unlinear flow for that object. It's not like traveling to the past and taking something to the future or vice versa. That still has a linear flow for that object. She has denied the linear flow of that object, and that is an anomaly that then causes more additional weirdness because you are now introducing something to a timeline that should not be there by any definition of physics. All the while, by the way, Max's own personal time does continue to move linearly, right? Even as she is rewinding and undoing events, like literally erasing them, denying that they ever happened, her own time continues to move forward at a normal rate. Oh, purely by the virtue of this one ability, reversing entropy, is Max one of the most ludicrously powerful beings to ever exist. And unfortunately, that's not the limit of Max's power. Reversing entropy is just the tip of the iceberg. I will be covering the other half of her power from the original game and how it connects to her power in double exposure in my next video, because otherwise this one would be 10 minutes long.